And we are live with Joe Nathan, who is described by the Minnesota Charter Association as being a provocateur who started his career as an educator and a teacher in St. Paul, going back before the time of what we now call charter schools, back to the time when Minneapolis, the Twin Cities overall, were well-resourced to try different types of schools. When I say Minneapolis, I should say the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, were well-resourced through local and federal aid to try schools that took on wildly different shapes than what we consider to be traditional public schools. There were schools without walls. There were schools with walls. There were schools inside and outside, free schools, open schools, schools on pogo sticks. There were all different kinds of schools. And Joe was instrumental in the exercise of trying to figure out how could school be done differently. Also the author of a book. Is it Free to Teach, Joe?
Actually, 3 books.
Free to Teach
is the first.
Yeah.
Free to Teach, Achieving Equity and Excellence in Public Education, which led to me being hired by Lamar Alexander and the National Governors Association. And that's very relevant to this conversation about the roots of educational empowerment for families. Second book was called something about computers. And the third book was called Chartered Public Schools, Achieving Equity and Excellence in Public Education. So 3 books.
So the author of 3 books. Good morning, Joe Nathan. Thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Joe, one of the reasons I really love talking about you, I've known you now for probably at least 13 years or so, somewhere in there, is that I've always appreciated the fact that you have a background knowledge of the way education went down over the years. I just mentioned part of it. We went through a period in the 19 changes and opportunities were opened up to run new kinds of schools, different schools within the district, outside of the district, within magnet schools, within, open schools with new pedagogy, all of that. And at some point, a lot of that seemed to slow down. A lot of the energy behind new schools seemed to slow down, and we went, feels like backwards. But specific to charter schools, I get in so many conversations on a every other day basis, pretty much, where people say charter schools haven't lived up to their original premise of allowing educators to try new things and then to help make the bigger system better. Charter schools have creamed kids. They have, just go down the list. You hear them all too. You've heard all of the kind of narratives around it. It comes from some pretty prominent people nationally also. Diane Ravitch has an entire network of people that are participating in this narrative, this negative narrative about charter schools. But you were there from the beginning. So it'd be nice to know from you, how do we think about the rhetoric around charter schools not living up to their original promise? If you were somebody who heard that today and you don't know much of the background, what would you say to someone who needs to learn what charter schools were meant to be, what they've become, and how they how they fit within the educational landscape writ large?
Sure. Well, again, thanks, Chris, for asking the question. I have been, as you noted, someone who writes about this, but also I've been an urban public school teacher and administrator. I've helped to create new, innovative public schools, both inside school districts and outside school districts. We have 3 kids who've all attended and graduated from urban public schools. My wife, 45 years, was a public school teacher in St. Paul. We have 5 granddaughters, all of whom are going to urban district public schools. All our 3 children all have worked for the St. Paul Public Schools, and one of them currently is a teacher in the St. Paul Public Schools. So we've been very deeply involved with urban district public education for a long time. So to answer your question, I'd point to 3 things as potential answers. The first is, I think that everybody who really cares about urban public education ought to read an incredible article that I read in college by a guy named Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark was an African-American child psychologist who, with his wife, developed the so-called doll test that was used by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 to argue that separate was unequal and that the existing system was not acceptable. By he was a hugely influential person, in other words, not just an academic who wrote for journals that almost nobody reads, but a hugely influential person with the U.S. Supreme Court, which, of course, had some, not as much impact as many of us would like, but some impact on the country, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So that's 54. By 1968, Kenneth Clark was so frustrated with district schools that he gave a speech, and that was reprinted in the Harvard Ed Review in 1968. The title of the article is Alternative Public Education. And he wrote, in part, and I think this is absolutely critical for people who want to understand chartering and empowerment and education. I think this is the most important article that I point to in understanding this. Kenneth Clark, co-author of the Dahl test, wrote, and I'm quoting directly, alternatives, realistic, aggressive, and viable competitors to the present public school system must be found. He didn't say should, might, could. He said must be found. The development of such competitive public school systems will be attacked by the defenders of the present system as attempts to weaken the present system and weaken, if not destroy, public education. This type of expected self-serving arguments can be briefly and accurately disposed of by asserting and demonstrating that truly effective competition strengthens rather than weakens that which deserves to survive. And then he goes on and he gives examples of new forms of organization. And he talks about, for example, unions creating new public schools. He talks about the federal government creating new public schools. He talks about colleges and universities creating new public schools. All of these would be outside the control of the local school district. He talks about other groups of people who would create new public schools open to all that would be organized outside the control of the district school system. Now, let's be clear. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, let's be clear about history, because history is often distorted, misrepresented. I quoted you the other day, a wonderful series of TV shows, Black History, Lost, Stolen, and Strayed. And American education system has been lost, stolen, and strayed. Unfortunately, Kenneth Clark's article, which I have cited to Diane Ravitch, which she dismisses, Kenneth Clark's article has been lost to many people. But it was, in 1968, by a renowned civil rights leader and author and researcher, a first statement: let's create new public schools outside the control of the local district. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that there's massive confusion between chartering and charter public schools. And it's a little bit like freedom of speech versus magazines. Magazines in the United States and newspapers are created because we have an overall freedom. It's called the freedom of speech. It's not unlimited, but we have major freedom of speech, which is wonderful. Chartering is a verb, not a noun. And that's not just a grammar lesson. Chartering means to give people the opportunity to create new public schools that are non-sectarian outside the control of local districts. And charters are the kind of thing that happens because of that. But district schools can be created under the charter model. Other kinds of schools can be created. So we talk about the freedom to create. And I'm going to respond directly to your question about, am I disappointed? Or should we be disappointed? Chartering has spawned thousands of schools, some of which are massively effective, just like freedom of speech has spawned thousands of newspapers and magazines, some of which are very reputable and some of which are not. We ought to be talking about, in my opinion, the value of chartering. So the second point of the three is that we need to understand chartering is the principle that many of us talked about and proposed that was adopted in 1991. That's second point of three. The third point is that Ted Coldery, who I know you've talked with many times, Ted Coldery has written an article that was discussed in the late 1980s called "The States will have to withdraw the exclusive," and basically what he meant was states will have to withdraw the exclusive power that they've given to local districts to create public schools. Actually, and I've pointed this out to Ted, in many states, including Minnesota, all public schools were not controlled by local districts. Most states have had, for example, a school for kids who are hard of hearing, or kids who are hearing impaired. Most states have had a statewide school, not controlled by local schools, for certain groups of kids. So anyway, we need to understand the idea is to create the freedom to create new schools. Will all of the schools that are being created be fantastic schools? No. Have some of the schools that have been created, are some of the schools that have been created fantastic schools? Absolutely yes. Should we be learning from those schools? Absolutely yes. Is the traditional school system resistant to learning from complex new ideas? Absolutely yes. But are there some examples of some people within district schools that are willing to learn from new ideas? Absolutely yes. And finally, should we have cross-district charter for cross-fertilizations? Again, absolutely yes. And I can give some examples of the absolutely yes. There are some wonderful examples that you won't hear about from the regressives like Diane Ravitch, but there are some wonderful examples at the local, state, and national level of collaboration, district and charter, that really helping kids.
That's a lot. That's a lot of background, and it's worth it, to walk people and trace people back through some of the origins. You started with Kenneth Clark, who was the famed doctor who him and his wife, Mamie Clark, did the doll test within the Brown versus Board of Education case that showed that there was a factor within the way that we were structuring schools that made children feel inferior, specifically Black children feel inferior when they encountered the inferior conditions within their public schools. So he's part of the Brown case, as is Derek Bell, who I spoke about last week. And I can keep adding names of people who were part of that case who 10 or 15 years after the case discovered that it hadn't made the difference that they thought that it would make. It made them want to do something different. The paper that you're talking about with Kenneth Clark, you offered this to me years ago, and I read it, devoured it, and have read it many times since. And I'm going to make sure that everybody takes a look at this paper because it's really important to know where some of these things come from. Now, I don't know why Diane Ravitch would just reject this out of hand as part of the record, the history of education reform or Black education reform or whatever you would want to call it. But Dr. Kenneth Clark is a source that is hard to refute, and I will take him over Diane Ravitch any day of the week. This is the article that he wrote for the Harvard Educational Review, Alternative Public School Systems by Dr. Kenneth Clark. And in this, he gives, as you said, a strong endorsement for a new form of school system that happens outside of the traditional school system. And he doesn't limit who can actually participate. He basically says what has come true with charters, which is universities can run them, unions can run them, community groups, nonprofits, others. He just enumerates a wide group of people who should be able to be given a charter to run a school to help the kids that are closest to them. So I'd ask people to go and read that. You mentioned that chartering is a lot like freedom of speech. So the government gives you freedom of speech, or the Constitution gives you freedom of speech. How you use it, becomes like, your magazine. And there's a big difference between Field and Stream and, U.S. News and World Report. And the quality of those are going to be very different, whatever. I've likened it to a driver's license. The state gives you a driver's license, doesn't tell you everybody's going to be good drivers. It just tells you that, you've been licensed to drive. Some people are going to be better than others. There's going to be some fabulous drivers. There's going to be some middling drivers, and there are going to be some people that would get their driver's license taken away. Much like a charter. You get a charter from the state to drive a school, and some of them are going to be outstanding, some of them are going to be middling, and some of them are going to get shut down. Why do you think it is that we have come to know them as charter schools rather than the chartering process, which you say is a verb? And it seems like more people would agree with the verb, like the ability to just charter a school is different than a charter school.
I think some of us made a mistake, and I include myself, in referring too often to charter schools or chartered public schools. The name of my book in the 1990s was Charter Schools, Creating Hope and Opportunity in American Education. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in the early 1990s talking about the value of this. And I think some of us made a mistake, but I also think that some powerful forces have tried to promote research that compares district and chartered public schools. And the best response that I've heard to this actually came from someone in Colorado who said, that's not a wise thing to do. The person said, do we compare the gas mileage of rented and leased cars? Of course not. It's not a meaningful comparison. So some people have tried to argue chartered public schools have higher achievement, chartered public schools have higher graduation rates, chartered public schools this, that. What I've tried to do, and not successfully, frankly, in some cases, is say, let's learn from the most effective chartered public schools and let's learn from the most effective district public schools, and we can do better. So, for example, we had a project here in St. Paul funded by several local foundations to say the idea of high school kids earning college credits while they're still in high school is a really good idea. Lots of research to support that. So several foundations said, let's work with these schools, district and charter, and we were able to produce over a 3-year period more than 400% increase in the number of low-income students of color who were participating in and earning free college credits. And we did this with both district and chartered public schools working together, because each of the district and chartered public schools had some ideas about how to do this, and they learned from each other. So that's an example of how we ought to have collaboration, and we can have collaboration, rather than saying which is better, district or charter, which, as I said, I think is a stupid, unhelpful question, but an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of time has been spent debating which is better, district or charter. And I think that's been a huge mistake. I know some foundations that have funded this research disagree with me, but we've had this big debate, and it's consumed, I think, a lot of time, energy, and frankly, not been very useful. What I think we ought to be concentrating on is which is more effective, district or charter. Let me give you one other example of district and charter schools working together in the best interest of kids. And this is an example you may remember from the late 1990s. In the late 1990s, the National Collegiate Athletic Association decided that every high school in the state, in the country, district, charter, private, parochial, had to follow rules put out by the NC2A about which kids could and could not accept college scholarships. Now, you might think this is a long way from what we're really talking about. But in essence, the NC2A, college athletics, decided that kids who were involved, for example, in a current issues class, that wasn't an acceptable preparation for college. They decided the class that combined classroom work and community service wasn't acceptable. And we had a 3-year battle, which we ultimately won. We had people from across the political spectrum, from Jeannie Allen to Herb Cole and Jonathan Kozel, all criticizing this. We had a massive community organization, and we succeeded in getting the NC2A to back off. That was an example of district and charter people working together. So I believe strongly in that there are times for collaboration and there are times for competition. It's not one or the other, but I don't think we get anywhere by saying which is better, district or charter. I just don't think we get anywhere, and we spend a lot of time and energy on it.
Seems like that's what creates the political race. If you have to compare the two, which is better, a charter school or a district school, you get into the people who are really invested in one of them being better than the other, coming to blows with each other. Yet, if that's not even part of the discussion, you don't have to have it. We're not sitting around saying what's better, magnet schools or neighborhood schools, right? It's assumed that there's a place for both. There's a place for magnet schools. There's a place for, and are we saying that all magnet schools are awesome?
Of course not.
Right. Are we saying that they're all they have closed the achievement gap?
Of course not.
There's about the same number of magnet schools that there are charter schools. It's hard for me to understand sometimes why we're not having the same conversation about charters. About magnet schools.
Well, because it's about money and power. That's really what it's about. Well, it's about 3 things. It's about money, it's about power, and it's about how much impact can schools have on students. I came into public education in 1970. I had read many books in college, and I actually first read Kenneth Clark's magnificent 1968 essay in college. And then our mutual friend Howard Fuller reminded me about 10 or 15 years ago about this incredible essay. But I came into public and everything I read in the 60s, 50 years ago, showed that there was a huge split in public education. Could public schools have a massive impact on young people who came from poverty? Yes or no? And so there's a huge industry, and I do mean industry, of people whose livelihoods depend on, in part, convincing other people that schools really can't have much positive impact on children from poverty. And they relentlessly write articles and do studies saying, see, even the best schools are not going to have much impact on poverty. And you see this with a lot of regressives who write articles constantly saying, if we really want to solve poverty, then we've got to eliminate racism, we've got to eliminate housing discrimination, we've got to deal with the police. And all of those things are critical to do.
And
along with
they're
improving
all about to
education.
happen right away too. They're about to happen any day now. So I don't know why you're so impatient, Joe, because any day now, racism is going to be a thing of the past. We're going to switch the entire American economy from a capitalist system to a socialist system any day now. So I just don't know why you're so impatient and want to start new schools.
Yeah. Well, I remember the debate in the 60s and 70s with a wonderful African-American educator named Ron Edwards, who talked about effective schools. And he described certain characteristics that I think almost nobody would argue that are characteristics of schools that do a really good job with low-income kids. And there was a vast literature that he produced. And then there was a vast literature of people in many cases, not all, but in many cases in colleges of education who said, no. If we really want to eliminate poverty, if we really want to reduce poverty, then we've got to do lots of other things. And frankly, I agree we need to do a number of things, but one of them is to have far more effective public schools, whether they're district or charter. So I think that there's another source of this historical record that's often ignored, and that is the bipartisan support that came from the National Governors Association in 1985. In 1985, I had written this book that you mentioned called Free to Teach. In 1984, then Governor Lamar Alexander asked me to coordinate a project for the National Governors Association that turned into a 1985 report, Time for Results. And in the report, which was produced literally by people like Bill Clinton, who of course later became president, Dick Riley, governor of South Carolina, who became the Secretary of Education with Bill Clinton, and a host of other governors, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. In Time for Results, the governor, Alexander, said in the introduction to this, the governors are ready for some old-fashioned horse trading. We're ready to regulate less if the educators are willing to be more responsible for results. The report was called Time for Results. The governor basically proposed one of the central principles of chartering, which is more autonomy at the local school level in exchange for greater accountability for results. Not greater accountability for, did you check this form? Did you submit this report? Did you follow this procedure? That's not what Governor Alexander, that's not what Governor Clinton, that's not what Governor Riley meant. They meant accountability for results. And that was one of the central principles of chartering.
And it was bipartisan. I think, when people hear Lamar Alexander, of course, he's a Republican, and that fits within people's stereotype of where charter schools came from. They came from some sort of attempt to, I don't know whether you would call it liberalize or, attack the mainline system as failing. The system's failing, so we got to do something else. And Republicans believe that, and it's very much a right-wing thing. And a lot of it is because you disrespect teachers or public education, or you have disrespect for the system overall, and you want to blow it up, really. So you want to do something different. But that's not the full story. I mean, some of the people that you have already mentioned. First of all, let's talk about some of the Black voices. You just mentioned Dr. Kenneth Clark earlier. And I don't think anybody ever puts that on the record. So for all of my watchers, my viewers, anybody who wants to have a smart conversation about charter schools, please go back and read the paper that Kenneth Clark wrote before anybody else wrote, before Al Shanker, before Ray Budd, before anybody who takes credit for what's the chassis of what became charter schools. Go back and at least give a black man his due for having kind of given a vision of what alternative public schools could look like long before any of those people took it and ran with it, or took some version of it and ran with it. So his work, Alternative Public School Systems by Kenneth Clark, please look that up and read it. The second thing that you just put on the record is Edmonds. So his work around, Ronald Edmonds' work around effective public schools, which also took place in the 70s research and still as of today has a lineage, it has people still use his work, and they come from the same place. They come from a place of saying, like, listen, we've tried a lot of things in urban education to make education efficient, effective, to make the outcomes better, and to get Black and brown kids through the gates of college. And it hasn't worked. We've tried integration, we've tried funding schemes, we've tried lawsuits, we've tried a lot of different things. The one thing we haven't tried are educational interventions around things like, can you teach? Can you build a school that actually works for kids and, that makes effective schools? So for people watching, I just want to keep pointing to these type of resources. But who else are we missing, Joe, in the line of bipartisan supporters? You mentioned Ted Couldry. There were people like Charlie Weaver. There were people like Ember Reichkott. Some of these were Republicans. Some of them were Democrats. Who else are we missing in the mix of early chartering?
Paul Wellstone was a very liberal Democratic U.S. Senator. Paul was a huge advocate of chartering. He saw how, as a liberal Democrat, this would empower low-income communities. He also understood how chartering could empower educators. And one of the often untold stories around the country is that there are literally thousands of educators with a dream who've been empowered by chartering to create that dream. And I'll give you, so anyway, Paul Wellstone is an example. Ember Reichkott Young was a Democrat, still is a Democrat. Mentioned Bill Clinton. We have the example, of course, of President Barack Obama, clearly a Democrat, clearly a progressive, who was a strong supporter of chartering. Those are some examples around the country. And there are also Latinx people who we haven't gotten into who have been strong supporters here in the state of Minnesota. Carlos Mariani Rosa, who has a long tenure at the Minnesota legislature, is the executive director of the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership, has been in the legislature for a long time, one of the leading Democrats, has strongly endorsed chartering as one of, not the only, but one of the steps that's valuable to help produce dramatic gains for kids from low-income families. So there certainly have been a variety of Democrats as well as Republicans who have been supportive of this. And I think it's important for the historical record to be clear. And when I said that Ravage dismissed this, what I meant was that when I pointed this out in a direct conversation with her that's in writing on her blog, she said, well, Kenneth Clark wouldn't have liked chartering. And I said, well, here's what he wrote. She wrote back, well, Kenneth Clark wouldn't have liked chartering. So, this continuous loop circle, like, here's what he said. Well, he wouldn't like it. Here's what he said. He wouldn't like it.
What's so amazing about that, too, is that, first of all, how would she know? Second of all, Kenneth Clark went on to do lots of things after writing that paper, including work in Harlem and in other places that were still characteristic of everything he wrote in that paper, of looking for out of school and new economic opportunities for urban youth. So the idea that she would know is ridiculous. Here's the really part that really burns me up about it. And you're not going to engage in this, I understand. But at the time that Kenneth Clark was writing all of this, Diane Ravitch was a neoconservative, a neocon, masquerading as a Democrat with kids in private schools, and who was definitely against all of the protests, all of the marches, all of the more radical element of the Democratic Party at the time. So the idea that all these years later, she would become the person who would understand the history of Black intellectual thought on alternative schools as it comes through someone like Kenneth Clark is disgusting in some ways. But I mean, I'll leave it at that. I mean,
yeah. Let me mention one other person that I apologize for not mentioning earlier, and that's a woman named Rosa Parks, who will be known to everyone who is watching this podcast.
I was wondering if you're going to get to that part.
And some friends from Detroit called me in the early 1990s and said, Rosa Parks is real frustrated with what's happening in Detroit. And Rosa Parks is trying to start charter public schools. Can you share some information? So I did. And there is a documentation of what I've just said in the New York Times. That article is available. And I think you have it. I can certainly make it available to anybody who wants to see it. But Rosa Parks did try to start several chartered public schools. Unfortunately, she ran into precisely the same problem that many local educators ran into, that frankly Al Shanker was talking about, which was that she tried to get authorization from a local school district, and that was refused. So anyway, I think it's important to understand Rosa Parks was very much a part of all of this.
I mean, which is definitely a someone who's off the beaten path, not necessarily what you normally hear when you talk about charter schools. When you are talking about like neoliberalism and a plot to attack our great American public schools or whatnot. I want people to see this just so that we're always giving people kind of like the link and the truth. So this is from the New York Times, 1997, June 3rd, Rights Hero Press's plan for school in Detroit. This is about Rosa Parks attempting to get the first charter in Detroit to run a charter school. She had already, as so many people of color and Black people who have started charter schools, she had already been running an school of sorts, like an after-school program that she thought she could serve more kids by making it an official school and starting a more formal system of learning for the kids in Detroit. So anyways, there you have it right there. Adding to the list of people that we've already talked about with Kenneth Clark, who was before charter schools, and then Ron Edmonds, who's the effective schools research person who happened around the same time and shortly thereafter, which is still today part of the educational landscape in terms of research. And then Rosa Parks, civil rights icon of the time. Back when there were only 700 charter schools nationwide, she was attempting to get a charter to start a school for good reason, right? It wasn't that she wanted to destroy anything. It was that basically she had the rightful attitude, which was the schools were destroying us. Like the inefficient, ineffective schools were hurting us. And many people just like her situated across the country were looking for different ways to do things in schools. So Joe, let me ask you a different question though. Why not? We talked about magnets a little bit earlier. Why not just magnet schools? Why do schools that are outside of the system when magnets offer you the ability to do most of what charters want to do, but still do it within the district system?
There's a critical phrase in your question that allow you to do most of what chartering does. And those of us who have been educators for some time, in my case, almost 50 years now, but it doesn't need to be 50 years, it might be 5 or 10, have run into a series of frustrations. And the frustrations have to do with power and they have to do with money. So I have many, many friends who work within district schools, and they have tried in many cases to run fantastic schools within districts, and some of them succeeded. And I celebrate that. I celebrate their work. But Al Shanker in 1980s column wrote about the frustration that many people within district schools who tried to be innovators run into. And Shanker ended up going after the idea of chartering because he got a lot of heat from people who said, look, some of these schools are being organized by people who don't believe in unions, which was true. And he got a lot of heat about that. He also got a lot of heat from union members for other reasons. So he ended up being opposed to chartering, but he correctly described the situation that many of his union members who wanted to try new things encountered when they were within districts. And he said in a late 1980s article, actually it was an ad published by, printed in the New York Times, paid for by the American Federation of Teachers. He said, educators who try to create new kinds of options within the district schools are, quote unquote, often treated like traitors or outlaws for daring to move outside the lockstep. And if they somehow manage to start something new, they can look forward, again, here's a direct quote, to insecurity, obscurity, and outright hostility. And many of the wonderful educators who have tried to create and sustain terrific, innovative district schools have been, as Shanker correctly said, treated like traitors or outlaws if they somehow manage to create these schools. And all over the country, we have examples of fantastic district schools that have been closed down because the superintendent left, because a new school board came into power. And so I celebrate and honor and have been writing newspaper columns for literally since 1989, celebrate wonderful things happening, excuse me, in district public schools. But I also recognize that chartering is a fundamental principle that I think is similar, as I said earlier, to freedom of speech. It seems to me that chartering builds on three fundamental principles in America. First, the idea that we say to people, you can try something new, something that maybe helps solve a problem. Number one, if number two, you're willing to be responsible for results. You can't just go off and do something. You have to be responsible for results. And number three, you have to operate within some principles. Those are three very fundamental principles of America. Those are three fundamental principles of chartering. So I think that people who want to create schools within the district, I celebrate it. People call me constantly and ask for help, and I'm very willing to do that. We have lots of free resources on our Center for School Change website, www.centerforschoolchange. Lots of resources there for both district and charter folks. We promote collaboration, district and charter. We actually have a collaboration going on between district and charter folks who are trying to reduce homelessness. But district people run into some problems. And one of the problems is the staff, because in many districts, last hired is first fired, which means if they try to do something significant about the racial disparities and the lack of African American and Latinx and other Asian American, American Indian, indigenous people, teachers, which is a huge national problem / scandal, which millions of dollars have been spent on. But one of the problems in many urban districts is last hired, first fired. So the younger, often people of color who are hired, get laid off first. Anyway, there are problems within the district structure that suggest to many of us that Kenneth Clark was right, that Rosa Parks was right. Let me update this really quickly because you asked about prominent progressive people of color. So I want to cite two people who are going on today, David Ellis and Tony Simmons here in St. Paul. And David was a young man that I literally met in the early 1970s. He had been kicked out of a district school and referred to the school where I was. We got him involved in a program where kids solve consumer problems. And as a part of that, David quickly learned to use his anger and his rage to solve real problems. We had, for example, a problem with a car dealership, and the car dealer had not done something he was supposed to do, not given somebody a radio. Some of the kids said, let's call the Consumer Protection Bureau, let's call the owner. David's solution was to write the problem down on a piece of paper because he learned it was important to write it down on a piece of paper, and then to wrap it around a rock and throw it through the window of the dealer. And that would not have solved the problem. That would have created more problems.
I don't know. It would have made things even, though, but keep going.
Well, anyway, David soon learned that he could use his anger and his rage as a 16-year-old African-American man, inner city young man, to really solve problems. And the local newspaper came to the school and had a picture of a couple of us in the class, both David and myself and some other students. And David came to me a few weeks later and said, I often thought I might have my name in the paper. I even thought I might have my picture in the paper because David had been in some serious activities in St. Paul, criminal activities. He was guilty of these. He was a very tough, angry young man, and he had some scrapes that ended up in juvenile court. So anyway, David came to me and said, I thought I might have my name in the paper, even thought I might have my picture in the paper, but I never thought it would be for something good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, David graduated from this innovative district school that I helped start and worked at for 7 years. He went to work for Prince, the entertainer, musician. And he and Prince produced together a platinum record. David has a copy of that. But he and Prince had some disagreements about some things like the role of women and some other things. So anyway, David set up a recording art studio in downtown St. Paul. And David quickly encountered young people who were 15, 20 years younger than he was, who could barely read, but they loved music like he loved music. So he discovered that they could barely read. So he brought in some people to help tutor the folks so they could understand contracts that they were signing in his recording arts studio. Anyway, this evolved, and David created a school called High School for Recording Arts. This is a school that is so sophisticated now in terms of technology that it has been named, the kids produce under contract, not under grants, under contract with organizations like Verizon Wireless or State Farm Insurance or the Minnesota Office of Higher Ed. They produce YouTube videos and public service announcements. Junior Achievement has named this school as the nation's best student-run small business because these kids run the business. And all of the kids who are in the school, about 300 to 400, all of the kids are kids with whom traditional schools have not succeeded. And about 40% of the kids are kids who are currently homeless. So this is an incredible, innovative school set up by a young African-American man named David Ellis here in St. Paul. It's been around for more than 20 years. And the co-director of the school is a wonderful attorney named Tony Simmons. David, one of the many strengths that David has is recognize what he can do well and what he can't do well. And he recognized that he needed some legal expertise and administrative expertise that he was not really good at. So he brought in as the co-director and now the director, although David is still there working very actively with his contacts in the music industry. But Tony Simmons is a remarkable African-American attorney who's the director of the school. And they have helped other people around the country set up schools. This is one of 1,000 examples of what I could give of innovative new approaches that have been dramatically more successful with inner city kids. Haven't eliminated racism, haven't eliminated poverty, haven't found jobs for everybody, haven't eliminated homelessness, all of which absolutely need attention.
Well, and I think this story is super important, though. I wish more people knew about it, but a lot of people nationally do know about the High School Recording Arts because I noticed that a lot of people visit. They come here to see this school and they go back. And I've always been amazed by this because this isn't one of those schools that is kind of like drill and kill and all the kids sitting in a little row and, it's, the whole no excuses thing. This is a lot of what we have more of. And maybe you could talk about this a little bit, Joe, but Minnesota, the birthplace of charter schools and chartering of schools as the birthplace, has a very different charter market than anything I see wherever else I go in the country. Like in terms of wildly different types of schools that don't fit the mold, not a ton of these big chain schools, lots of mom and pop operations, all of which you have somehow, participated with, know the people around. High School for Recording Arts is everything you just said. It gives kids a program that makes them want to keep coming back. They get involved in the music business from end to end. It's not just recording, but they know how to make a CD from the beginning to conceptual part to marketing it and selling it towards the end, and everything in between they know how to do. And oh, by the way, all of the technical equipment that you need to learn and all of the business that you need to learn, they learn this. Average age of a newcomer, like a freshman in that school, is 19. So oftentimes these are kids that have been either kicked out or pushed out of the regular district public schools and not seen as valuable. And then they find their groove at this school. And you also mentioned the high number of them that are homeless at this school. Some of the teachers there, and I know multiple people that have worked there, are people who have been licensed, went through college, had support and everything as homeless people. And come back and teach, right? So they have teachers that have been homeless in the past. Not the normal story that you normally hear about charter schools, like when you're busy talking about the militaristic charter schools that make people walk in a line and put their finger on the lip and all that. But Minnesota's entire charter school kind of market has more of those type of stories. Like talk a little bit about Bill Wilson, what he did now that he's not with us anymore. Such a stalwart here, but tell people a little bit about Bill Wilson's school.
Glad to talk about Bill, and then I'd like to talk about teacher-powered, teacher-led schools, which is another innovation from Minnesota that actually is spreading throughout the country. So I'd like to come back to that. Bill was a remarkable young man. Bill grew up in the 40s and 50s in southern Indiana, and he was assigned to a school with many fewer resources because he was African-American, and he never forgot that. He did graduate from high school in Indiana. He did go on to college. He did earn a college degree. He came to Minnesota. He was involved in a variety of activities, and people asked him to run for office. He became the first African American elected to the city council in St. Paul. He became the first African American who was named the president of the St. Paul City Council. He worked for a number of years at the University of Minnesota. He was named by a liberal Democratic governor to be the statewide commissioner of human rights. So he had a distinguished career. Bill became deeply frustrated, like Kenneth Clark, with the thousands and thousands of kids locally who were African American and Latinx and low income who were not succeeding in district schools. And so he founded a charter school. So here's a man who's the former commissioner of human rights in the state of Minnesota, a liberal Democrat, and he founds a charter school. And virtually all of the young people in that school are African American. And some of the regressives in Minnesota and around the country have attacked this school. This school has been named as an outstanding public school by the largest newspaper in the state, by U.S. News and World Report. And nevertheless, it's been attacked because it's mostly African American. Bill and I wrote a column for the largest newspaper in the state. This is a picture of Bill being honored by the first African American mayor in the city of St. Paul. This is Bill sitting and Mayor Carter talking with him as a building is being named in Bill's honor. This is the second campus of the Higher Ground Academy, which is the school that Bill started. They now are, they have been for a number of years K-12, and they have had so many families come to this school that they've created in the last year a second campus. Anyway, Bill wrote a column and often testified at the legislature and said, look, there's a difference between the government saying to me and to saying to African Americans, you must go to this school, which, by the way, will have less money and less other resources. You must, go to this school over here because you're African American or because you're American Indian or whatever. You must go to that school, as opposed to giving families options, one of which is the school that he helped to start. And we're having a huge battle in this state because some, in my opinion, regressives who are white, who like to paint themselves as huge advocates of low-income people, who, and by the way, at least one of them that you know well, an attorney, sent his at least one of his kids to an urban public school that was more than 90% white and less than 10% low-income kids. A very affluent neighborhood. That's
by the way,
for his own kids.
In a district that was like, majority of color and majority poor, right? Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So anyway, Bill went to the legislature, and the legislature listened to Bill, fortunately, and said, there's a huge difference between being told where you must go to school and being given a range of options, one of which is a school like ours. Mm-hmm. And that argument has prevailed at the Minnesota legislature, whether Republicans are in charge or whether Democrats are in charge. That argument has prevailed since 1991 because people see the value of a school that Bill has done, and they see the value of some other schools. Now, are some of the schools that are predominantly low income, predominantly African American, not doing particularly well? Absolutely, yes. And dozens of them have been closed, which is part of the charter idea.
I want to say this about
Bill, a little bit more about Bill. That I do want to just talk for a moment about the teacher-led school phenomenon, because that's really critical, and that actually is spreading.
So let's come back to that real quick. But I just want, before we leave Bill Wilson, who I think is actually the reason that I bring him up is because we keep forgetting people. We have these conversations about charter schools and chartering and new education and whatnot. First of all, we only talk about white people when we have that discussion. We talk about the white people that we love or hate within charter world, and we forget that people of color have long been starting their own schools, have long been part of this movement, and not part of, haven't been the help, but have been the pioneers, have been the thinkers, have been the builders, and get relegated to the part of charter history that's kind of like that separate room, that little room over there. Wow, which is a trick. Personally, I think it's a trick. It's a trick of like, that's the way you get people to hate charters, is to not talk about the people who are building them out of their own communities, out of their own interest, but just focus exclusively on the ones that are super problematic and have lots of problems going with them. Bill Wilson and I, the conversations that him and I had, the few that we had, I actually visited Higher Ground for the first time many years ago. And I remember at that time, one of the things that stuck out to me was how highly educated. The teachers were. He had a lot of he had higher than his fair share of PhD teachers teaching, regular education kids at the time. This changed over time, and definitely had more teachers of color over time and staff in the building. And him and I had this conversation about Indianapolis because, as you mentioned, he grew up in Indiana. And we talked about Crispus Attucks, which was a Black school started by the White Citizens Council that took all the Black kids out of all the surrounding schools and put them in one as a way to segregate them and to make sure that, none of those Black kids married anybody's white daughter. And what happened was that school ended up outperforming all of the white schools because at the time, Black PhDs could not get jobs at the university level. So they ended up all teaching in this one school. And him and I laughed over this story. We had a great laugh, and I'll never forget it. It's one of the things I found common ground because he's here in Minnesota, but he knew about that story. He knew about Indiana and Indianapolis. And here he is locally in Minnesota being tagged with, because he runs a school that had many African students in it, such a high proportion of African students who came and found common ground, white liberals, as you're calling them, regressives, attacking him as running an segregation school. And he was one of the few people that could be like, no, don't talk to me about segregation, because I did segregation. I understand what segregation is long before any of you in this land of northern milk and honey even knew what the concept was really about. I did segregation. So let's not do that. Well, now that he's gone, let's not talk about it as if that battle is in the past tense, because we have a state lawsuit here in the state of Minnesota that literally would penalize schools like his for not having white students. And I'm not going to stop saying it. I've said this across maybe 5 different shows. I keep bringing this up. This is one of the lines of attack. You are a person of color who's running a school with lots of people of color in it. Obviously, there must be something wrong. Obviously, we need to get you some white people in your school. But we're not saying that in Minnesota to the opposite. We're not saying that to the white schools in Rice and in Cokato and, in Deer Creek, Minnesota, who have all white students. We're not saying to them that they need some Negroes in their schools to actually make it work. We're only saying that to people of color like Bill. Anyways, a little bit of commentary on my part. I just had to say it, had to do it. I don't want to leave this man's history without saying he left us, all of us, a challenge to this progressive idea around what is and isn't segregation and whether charters have a part in it. But let's move on. Teacher-led schools, and this is where you and I are probably going to have a little bit of disagreement, but let's go for it. So okay. Teacher-led schools, you're saying, are a thing, and it's expanding. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Sure. So the idea here, and thank you for your comments about Bill. I completely agree with everything that you said about Bill. Remarkable man, unfortunately, within the last year has passed on. But the school continues, and the school continues with an African-American director, Dr. Samuel Yigza, who is a PhD and a distinguished educator, and with a number of African-American educators. So the school continues. Bill did a fantastic job of transition. He knew that he was not well. He made sure that he had developed a strong base. So anyway, that's another aspect of Bill's wonderful leadership and his heritage. Part of the impetus for chartering in Minnesota came from people in rural Minnesota whose parents had been farmers and had been a member of farmer co-ops. And what happens in a farmer co-op is that the farmers get together and they decide, all right, we're going to put our wheat or our milk or whatever together, and we're going to say, we will approach the people who want to buy these products, and we will together work on this so that we can get a better price. Our working conditions can be better, and we can have more fairness for ourselves. And that same idea has now been applied to public education. So we have a group of charters where the majority, not all, but a majority of the people on the board of directors are people who work in the school. This is an incredible opportunity for educators to create the kinds of schools that they think make sense, which frankly was one of the central principles, PLES, principles of chartering from the beginning, to give educators a chance to create new kinds of schools. And that's one of the things that's often, as you point out, Chris, often not discussed. All over the country, educators, including not only ones I've mentioned, but Ricardo Morales, for example, in Los Angeles, Yvonne Chan, and I could go on for the next hour. I won't, but I could. people of color who have been frustrated within district schools have been given a chance by chartering to create the kinds of schools that they make sense. Well, one example of this is groups of educators who have created schools where the teachers are a majority of the board of directors. I'm not saying that's the only way to go, but it is one example of the kind of innovation that is created. And interestingly, some of the unions are endorsing this idea. There are a handful of district public schools around the country that are experimenting with this idea where the real decisions are being made by a coalition of the teachers who work in the school and families, and in some cases in secondary school students. So I think the teacher-led school is a really exciting idea as an option. It's not the only way to organize, but I think it's one way to organize. And it's certainly something that's quite different than the traditional district system in which you have an elected school board, they hire a superintendent, you have a central office, and then the actual teachers are down at the bottom of decision making. And by the way, maybe the families are involved, maybe they're involved not at all. But in this case, with the teacher-led schools, it is teachers often working with families on the board of directors who are making critical decisions. I think it's a great option.
I've been a fan of that option for a long time. And I've thought really good things about it years ago. As you know, you were one of my mentors and one of my informants when I was on the school board, someone I could take policy to and say, hey, help me make sense of this. So we did the teacher-run schools as a policy in the Minneapolis public schools. I was a big fan of it. I thought, okay, listen, I'm for all kinds of schools and all kinds of options. So open enrollment, I was for it. For PSEO, I was for it. For kids going out to the suburbs and playing football, I was for it. For kids coming into the cities from the suburbs to do art and different programs and integration programs, I was for it. For the interdistrict integration districts that we did, I was for it. Little known to people now who think that I'm a complete segregationist. I'm an integrationist who was mugged by integrationist policy at some point, but I was for all of that. And when it came to teacher-run schools, of course I was for it. I actually worked directly with some teachers that were trying to start different types of schools. And I was very supportive of some that took sabbaticals to try and start like micro-society schools within the district, for instance, which I was really a fan of and thought it was a brilliant concept, still do. But like so many things in public education that you're for, you see them turn out to be crap at some point, not on the part of the teachers and not on the part of the people who want to run the schools, just in general. It's so hard to work with districts. It's so hard to start new things. So we passed a law in the state of Minnesota, and I shouldn't say we, you were, at the lead of that, the ability to start a law that said teachers can start schools, like little groups of teachers can start their own schools, and made a pathway to making it happen within districts. And you can tell me better, but I think we produced one. Like, I was such a fan of this process. I thought, oh my God, this is going to set education on fire. Teachers themselves are going to take over schools or start new schools without the district brass and the principals and everybody getting involved. And that's going to replace all these really bureaucratic kind of schools. I think we produced one.
Yeah, I think we've produced 4 or 5.
Okay.
And the St. Paul Federation, which strongly endorsed this proposal at the legislature, went to the school board and said, we want to do this. And the superintendent said no. And the union said, we really want to do this. We think it's a terrific idea. And the superintendent said no. And we actually had a policy on the books that was adopted by the district. And nevertheless, the superintendent said no. And I could give you examples all over the state of teachers who've said, I really want to do this. And there's some cases of local unions said, we really want to do this. And the school board of the superintendent says no. So go back to the Shanker quote, people who, educators who want to create new kinds of innovative schools are often treated like traitors or outlaws. And I've seen this happen over and over again throughout the state of Minnesota and throughout the country, where often, not always, but often people who want to create really distinctive and innovative schools within the district structure are denied the opportunity. Is it still a good idea? Yes. And by the way, the union president who thought this was a really good idea, who had sessions to discuss this, is now the commissioner of education in Minnesota. Now, she's got her hands busy with things, but she still thinks it's a good idea. So, Kenneth Clark wrote in 1968, the chartering law in Minnesota was adopted in 1991. I hate that sometimes good things take a long time to get moving ahead, but sometimes they do. And I still think this is a good idea. But there's a group of people actively promoting this. There's a national conference about this, and the idea is spreading more slowly than I'd like, but it is spreading throughout the country.
So what's the part of the law that holds them up from being able to do it when they want to do it? Is it that it has to be approved by a superintendent or school board?
Well, the law says that it can happen in the charter sector, which it is. There are a number of these schools in the charter sector.
Mm-hmm.
The law also says it can happen in the district sector of public education. And you're exactly right. It has to be approved by a local board.
Okay, so let's start there, because I'm not going to buy the idea that the reason that it doesn't happen is because of the superintendent and the school board, for one very big reason, which is we happen to know, and you've been part of this, and this is like one of the areas where you and I are not necessarily aligned. Love you to death, Joe, but we actually really disagree on this part, which is I actually don't think that the unions are agents for change or for good things for kids. Actually, I think they're terrorist organizations that are harming brown and black children every day in terms of education policy. They're keeping terrible teachers in the schools. They're fighting for all the wrong stuff. They never fight for academics or better achievement. They always fight for material gain and material benefits for themselves. More staff, more dues members, more control over the managerial prerogative so that they can have less accountability. And they do it all in the name of social justice on a routine basis. Just my commentary on that. No, you won't agree. And I don't want anybody listening to this to say that Joe Nathan believes that. Associate all of that with me, with my kind of racial outlook on unionism in education. However, when the person that you mentioned, who is now our commissioner of education, who left St. Paul to go work for Randy Weingarten and come back again, can't think of a bigger terrorist to educational choice than Randy. She quickly comes back and sets about doing everything that they ever wanted to do, which was attacking testing and attacking school choice and attacking charter schools and attacking any semblance of anything that unions don't want. What they don't do, though, Joe, what they don't do is put on T-shirts and start marching for student achievement or around things like this. It's very convenient to say the superintendent and the school board wouldn't let us do these teacher-run schools that we really want to do, knowing that they've gotten the school board elected, right? Knowing that they elected, basically the union elected a slate of people onto the board who are basically, in my mind, again, anybody listening or watching, don't associate this with Joe, associate it with me, but basically a ventriloquist board, a remotely controlled board by the union. Why can't they do teacher-led schools if they can basically twist the arm of the district, do all kinds of things like signing contracts that they can't possibly afford? And you know, why I don't get it. I had this conversation with Lynn Norgren in Minneapolis, for instance, like, Lynn, why aren't you guys out there like organizing around these teacher-led schools? This was years ago. Like, you guys organize around everything else. Why don't you slap on some T-shirts and get some tennis shoes on and get out there and organize? Because the district will fold. The superintendent will fold. So anyways, I'm sorry. Long-winded way of asking, well, if they want it so bad, how come they haven't organized around having these schools?
Yeah. Well, let me just ask you quickly, how much more time do we have? Because I wanted to make sure I understand.
I'm going to give you as much time as you need to go on about this.
All right. Well, can we take like a 2-minute break?
We sure can. And I'll give more context while we do that. Actually,
all right.
Time,
okay.
But I do want to hear your answer to this, and I don't want to deny my viewers your answer to that. But while you do that, I'm going to give more commentary.
All right. I will be back in 2 minutes. Okay.
All right. And I'm going to associate all of my commentary with you, by the way, Joe.
Okay. I'll respond in just a minute.
All right. Sounds good. So to people listening or watching, just for context and for background, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers is a teachers union that has been recognized nationally as really taking on the lessons of the Chicago Public School Teachers Union. The president here locally went and got radicalized by the Chicago Teachers Union and brought back their politics around teacher organizing. And it's almost 110% around electing the school board member and then forcing them to sign things into contract law. Number one, that maybe the district has a hard time affording in terms of money, or number two, things that strip the district of the ability to hold teachers accountable, things like teacher evaluation, and things like testing, standardized testing, and those things. All the while they're fighting that kind of regressive agenda, they are saying things like, we need to respect teachers. We need teachers to, we need to treat teachers like professionals. We need to listen to teachers. Teachers are the experts. They know how to run schools. They know what they're doing. And to Joe's point, there's this option. If you really feel like we should respect teachers and you know that teachers are the experts, there's this option that's afforded to them that they just don't take, which is they have the ability to start schools. They have the ability to run their own schools and to show us what they know. Now, what Joe is saying is, even though they have this ability to run and start schools, many of them are not either taking that opportunity or achieving that, having that opportunity, because from what Joe is saying, they have been blocked by superintendents and by school boards. Now, I could go on and on and on about the fact that literally, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers hired a board. They elected a board through a very low turnout system of electing boards of people that were all of their endorsees who basically are in their pocket. So if they wanted something to happen, they could make it happen around running schools. But anyways, Joe is back now. I just gave all of my Chris Stewart commentary. This is just Chris Stewart talking. This isn't everybody. Now, Joe gets to say the more rational thing to tell me why I'm wrong. So Joe, they have the ability to do it. But you say that they get blocked by the superintendent, by the school board. My response to that is they run the superintendent and the school board in many ways. They ran an entire superintendent out of town, right? And fired her and gave her $1 million to walk away because they didn't like some of her equity stuff. So they obviously have the power to make a superintendent do what they want to do. Why not? Why not on this?
Well, let's see. I've worked, as mentioned, in public education as a teacher, a parent, an administrator, a newspaper columnist, researcher since the fall of 1970, and I've had lots of experiences around the country with educators, with unions, union leaders. And I guess I would say that my experience, I'm not denying your experience, my experience is that it's more complicated, and that there are some union leaders who are very much interested in what we're talking about. And I want to encourage listeners to go to teacherpowered.org. That's a website, and you'll see, among other things, schools and networks, you'll see district and chartered public schools in Los Angeles and Massachusetts and Minnesota and Wisconsin, among other places, that have joined up for this movement. It's called teacherpowered.org. Yes, thank you. That's right there on the screen. And yes, in St. Paul, the union has enormous power. Yes, in St. Paul, the union did endorse a series of candidates, as well as a number of other committee people, one of whom was me. The people who were elected to the school board have been, for many of us, enormously disappointing. They have listened to the replacement, the superintendent that you alluded to, who you said the union didn't like her equity. That's a whole nother discussion that I'd rather not get into today. But she was the superintendent who convinced the board not to move ahead on teacher-powered schools.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the reason she was terminated or bought out, but it was a part of the frustration that many of us had. The current superintendent in St. Paul has expressed no interest whatever. School board members who were elected, who told a number of us that they were interested in teacher-powered schools, deferred to the superintendent. I've found very, very few superintendents who are interested in this idea. I don't think that the teacher power idea is moving ahead, not as fast as many of us would like, but it is moving ahead, and that's why I encourage people to take a look at it. I think that there are a variety of people involved in unions. I think that sometimes teacher unions are forced for growth and positive change. I think sometimes they are not. And certainly many of us, and I include myself, have battled with unions often, not always, but often over the last 50 years. So I think it's, you mentioned in Minneapolis where you were the school board member, and yes, you worked very hard, very skillfully to try to get this idea moving ahead. And I think it was frustrated by, frankly, people within the central office, not you, but people within the central office who really did not want to see that power of money and decision making go to the local school level.
And so, on that point, I will say this much: having been there and been on the inside, I think that there was more than one mindset internally going. Like there were some people internally who were very for this idea, very much for it. Sometimes for great reasons, and sometimes even for cynical reasons. Like the great reason was just, if we create small laboratories for teachers to actually have the say in how you design a school day, how you design the curriculum, how you handle some of the tougher challenges that we have at the point of sale, like at the kid level, we might get somewhere. So there were people internally who really believed that. There were other people who believed, hey, listen, teachers always want to tell us that they're the experts on things. Let's give them some schools. Let's give them the opportunity to show us what they got, type of thing. So that was the more cynical reason some people were for it internally. There were other people internally who just didn't understand how the money would work. Just like, and for them, they didn't care about any idea. They only cared about how money works. Like, if we give them this budget or that budget, that means we'll have to pull it from this or that or whatever. So it's that real kind of like narrow thinking internally. But I didn't find anybody who internally who was just like against it just because. I think a lot of people, had mixed feelings about it one way or the other. What I did see, though, was as an advocate for it, I was pushing the unions to be more organized about it. Like, what are you doing to help the teachers and support the teachers get their proposals across the finish line and have them be good, and have them and some of those teachers, very honestly, were channeling some of their frustration to me that they weren't getting support on all sides. They weren't getting support on any sides. And they were really asking me what could be done to help them get the ball across the thing. So anyways, I'm with you I'm still for this idea. I still think that teachers should have the platform and the opportunity to run schools just like anybody else. You mentioned earlier, though, that there is one way that they can do it, which is called charter schools. And I just, for the life of me, haven't been able to figure out why unions nationally haven't seized on not trying to unionize charter schools that already exist, that other people have already started, but starting their own, right? There's been one or two that they've started. They haven't all worked out real well. But Randy Weingarten years ago had the idea of, we're going to show people what we can do. We're going to show people that the contract of the union is not the problem. We're going to start charter schools to show them. In Minnesota, I don't think, and you can tell me if this is the same anywhere else, I don't think there's any other place in the country where a local teachers union is actually the authorizer of charter schools.
Actually, in Minneapolis, the authorizer started as an offshoot of the teacher unions and now is totally independent of the local teacher union.
The guild, the Minnesota, or
right.
Is it the Minnesota Guild? Yeah.
But I'm struggling to say something that would be useful here. I think one of the failures that of some of us in the beginning was that we failed to convince unions that this was an enormous opportunity for unions, not just to organize the people who were in the schools, but to give their members the chance to create truly wonderful new schools. And there was, in the beginning, in the early 1990s, there was interest on the part of both the AFT and the NEA in this. The NEA, the Minnesota Education Association, had a front page article in their statewide journal describing and praising a union member here in St. Paul who created the first charter to go into operation. So I think that there has been, I know there has been on the part of some people in unions a great interest in this idea. There's also a great fear on the part of unions in losing membership and losing dues. And I think those have been varying forces. You mentioned the former president of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, Lynn Norgren, who strongly did advocate for this, who testified at the legislature. I'm sorry, another former president,
Louise
Lundin, did testify in favor of this. and they are no longer presidents of the Minnesota Federation of Teachers. I think that there are different trends within unions, different parts of unions. On balance, clearly at the national level and in many states, the teacher unions have been opposed to this. They're opposed to giving groups of parents and teachers the power to create new public schools outside the system. They're clearly, strongly, vigorously opposed to that. They have put, in the case of some, they have put millions of dollars into the funding of various groups, community groups. They've provided money to university professors to criticize this idea, to do quote unquote research that shows this is a bad idea. I mean, we know that there's a whole center at the University of Colorado funded in part by the National Education Association and its affiliates. So yes, unions have fought many of these ideas. There also are members of unions, and there also are some unions that have been supportive. So I would say it's a mixed bag. But I think it's important, as you've said, to get the history right. And that's really why I appreciate what you've given me the opportunity to do today.
I think that's a great place to stop. For people listening and watching, I wanted to make sure, and Joe, hopefully you'll come back as often as I, can have you and reach out to you, because you've done this for years. And actually, I feel like I'm often in conversations with people that I wish were talking directly to or with people who were there from the beginning, who understand the history, because we talk about charter schools in a vacuum sometimes, and charter school policy like they were invented yesterday, and there's no kind of long history that involves many different types of people. It doesn't just involve kind of like what are called corporate reformers who want to militarize schools and do drill and kill schools or whatnot. Quite the opposite, because I never would have been attracted to any movement that produces those type of schools. So for people listening and watching, this is Joe Nathan. You can find Joe and a bio of Joe at the centerforschoolchange.org, centerforschoolchange.org. Also has 3 books, one of which I actually am reading right now for a program that I'm in, and I'm writing something. So Joe, I'll have to come back to talk to you a little bit about Free to Teach, because it's part of the basis of something that I'm writing right now. But also one of the long-term level-headed thinkers who sees things from all sides and is really trying to, and has always tried to, create something that everybody can support and participate in, not us versus them, and district versus charter, and teacher versus, the taxpayer, unions versus, non-union people, all of that stuff that we get lost in sometimes. So seek out Joe and get more of the real story on charter schools and charters. Chris? Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
I wanted to tell you a happy story, and then I want to ask you for your advice on something.
All right, let's do it, man.
The happy story is that one of the things that clearly has an impact on young people is homelessness. And one of the things that's happened here in St. Paul over the last 2 years is that the district and a number of charters have come together to say, let's work on this problem together. And so they've convinced the city council to put more money into affordable housing. They've convinced the county commission to house some kids who were homeless. We've helped to elevate the issue of youth homelessness, which had for many people been sort of hidden. And we've produced concrete results. We have kids who are now housed who are homeless. We have new facilities. And it's been a district charter collaboration. So that's part of what I see as encouraging. I see that we need to simultaneously work on problems inside schools and outside schools, not one or the other. It's both. Now, here's my question to you. You've been wonderful about trying to get the word out. Do you have advice for people like me who want more people to understand the real idea behind chartering, the real history? Do you have ideas for us? Because I've written articles for various publications. I've written a book. And obviously, today's discussion came about because you, I think, quite accurately describe a lot of people who are speaking nationally who don't know this history, who don't know what's really happened, who don't know about people like Bill Wilson, often don't know about others. So do you have advice for me?
I mean, the most simple advice that I give on that, honestly, is that the way to defeat what you're saying right now is to just have a massive communications campaign that creates different actors in different places and put them on multiple different platforms to keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. And it's been very successful. You have, like, I can show you 18 op-eds that have the same basic chassis underneath the op-ed, but supposedly written by different people, right? Placed here and placed there and placed there and placed there. And strategically, what happens too often on the side of charter people is that they lay down in the middle of traffic, right? They like, all of that's being said, all the big lie is out there and is being repeated constantly all day long. And very few people who are on this side of the fence actually insert themselves to say, actually, you're wrong. Actually, that's a lie. Here's why. Even what you did today, I think for some people will be the first time that they encountered Kenneth Clark. It'll be the first time that they encountered Ron Edmonds. It'll be the first time that they encountered Bill Wilson. It'll be the first time that they encountered the fact that Rosa Parks wanted to charter a school, right? So we are missing, like, many of the main points that would fill in the gap and make the public less dumb. And if I could say anything, it would be people need to start asserting their voice. They need to start doing it in a variety of ways. It's not just a blog post. It's not just an op-ed here or there. It's not just sporadic, but it really is people who are on a campaign to fix the public ignorance around charter schools. And to give you, like, one very concrete thing, for instance, thinking about new media and the way that people communicate now. We talked about the High School for Recording Arts. I can't think of a place that has more capable communicators that tell an alternative story to the thing that we think about charter schools all the time, right? They're literally in the business of communicating, right? And they're not the only school like that. I travel so many schools and see so many schools where I say to myself, I can't believe people don't know about you. I can't believe people aren't hearing your students. I can't believe the teachers that I meet in these places that tell me such brilliant things aren't the ones who are out on the front lines being lifted up to tell the real story. And I can't believe no one has funded a campaign around getting these to be the people that are heard and seen. Finally, I'll say this: Brightbeam, my organization, which I think is amazing because, well, it's my organization. So of course, I think it's amazing. We specialize in telling the stories of others and whatnot. We're always looking for actors and players who are willing to stand up and say the alternative thing, right? It's the thing that's alternative to the bad narrative that's out there. So for you, Joe, for anybody that you know, for you obviously have worked with so many people that you know are brilliant and the public doesn't know anything about. We should be lifting them up. We should be helping them get to the front of the line. And also, this is something I think you're really super well positioned to do, is we should be directly and consistently and every day challenging the people who write the major stories. We should be bird dogging journalists to tell a deeper, wider, more smart story about the things that we care about, because they're getting away with, like, murder when it comes to journalism on us right now. And you probably, knowing what I know here in the Twin Cities, many markets have been decimated when it comes to education journalism, right? So we are now a dead zone in the Twin Cities when it comes to educational journalism, and we shouldn't be. We should really be pushing the major outlets to do a better job of telling stories. Anyways, my long-winded advice, we could keep talking about it because you have great ideas, but I think the story has to be told.
So given that you've asked for the story to be told, and thank you, that's great advice. I want to tell one more quick story. The charter idea developed, as you said, in Minnesota, in part because of Kenneth Clark, in part because of Lamar Alexander, the National Governors Association, and others. But before the charter law passed, another law passed that was hugely controversial, that also is an empowerment of youth, and that's called Post-Secondary Enrollment Options, PSEO. And that was really the first example of what Kenneth Clark was talking about. In 1985, a group of Democrats, led by a Democrat, Governor Rudy Perpich, a very active Democrat and a governor and a very liberal guy, convinced the legislature in an enormous battle that high school students ought to be allowed to take courses for free, full-time or part-time, on college campuses, with the dollars following the kids, so that kids could literally earn a year or two of free college while they were a high school junior or senior. And that was an embodiment, in part, of Kenneth Clark's ideas that there ought to be new forms of public education outside the control of local school boards. Now, The
Mhm.
local school boards could not veto that. And of course, all hell broke loose. The unions hated it. The school boards hated it. The superintendents hated it, but it passed. And
Mhm.
it passed in 1985, and it has continued. It's now 2020. So you can do the math. It's been around a long time, and it has survived only because, in part, young people have stepped forward and families have stepped forward whenever it's threatened at the legislature, which happens periodically, and because we've told the story. So I think your advice is excellent. I also think it's important for people around the country to know about this Minnesota law, which has been refined and expanded and improved. Now, 10th graders can take courses for free with the dollars
Mhm.
following the kids. They can take
Mhm.
one career technical education course, and if they earn at least a C, they can take as many as they want. The point is that this is another example of empowering students and families to have the kind of education that is best for them. And we have literally more than 150,000 young people who have since 1985 have earned free college credits. Many of them have earned a year. Some of them earned 2 years of free college
Mhm.
credit. We also have a statewide organization in the state that some people might be interested in called People for PSEO. And the chairperson of the board is a young woman, African American young woman from a low income family, who learned about this in part from a publication that the Center for School Change did that was placed in libraries. Her name is Aaliyah Hodge, and she would be a great person for you to interview.
Oh, you should make the
Aaliyah,
introduction. Make the
yeah,
introduction.
I will do
Yeah.
it.
And this is what I say, because we are at time, but PSEO, yet
People for
again,
PSEO is
yeah,
the
and PSEO as a policy, again, yet another thing coming out of Minnesota. People need to give us our due when it comes to like new and innovative thinking around what can be done with schools. Could be the topic of an entire another show, and we should have this topic. We should do the show because for me, on the cynical side of things, it becomes yet another story about how you try to empower students and their parents and have their money follow them to better opportunities. And guess who shows up to say that it shouldn't happen, right? When I saw this battle taking place in schools, there was a battle between something called College in the Schools and PSEO. And PSEO allowed a student to be dual enrolled with an actual college and go to the actual college campus. And an inner city kid who is leaving an inner city public school and going to a college and seeing what it's like there, to me, is better than a million lectures about what college is about. Right. Like, I saw it myself with having some kids that were in an early college program. Um, but the college and the schools thing keeps you in the school that you're in and brings the college to you inside the school. And the reason that's preferable for many people within the school system is because the money stays with you in your high school, right? Supposedly, the money stays with you in your high school. Nothing I just said has anything to do with what's best for kids. Has to do with what's best for policy or what opens a world. It only has to do with who gets the money. And that is the essence of so many education battles that we're having right now, is not that it's best for kids to be able to go to. By the way, the University of Minnesota has a very, very, very spotty reputation for admitting local kids of color, especially within the city of Minneapolis. So any opportunity for them to get out of a district school and into the college early and to see what it's all about, we should be all for. No one should be against that, right? But if it means that they're going to take their money with them for some of those classes and take them in a college campus, guess who's going to be against it? People who
Sure.
want to keep them in the school. So,
Good news
anyways,
is the good
good.
news is that this battle has gone on since 1985, and the students have won.
They
The
keep
kids
winning. Yeah, that's
keep
a good
winning.
point. That's a good point. That's not a bad track record.
So,
Yeah.
and we've expanded the law. I mean, the law a couple of years ago, we had a huge battle because kids are getting messed over and not told information, and so passed a law that says that the kids, the school districts have to give them accurate information. Some districts do, some districts don't. The Commissioner of Education, after we issued a report earlier this year, 2020, wrote to the school district and said, "Folks, this is a state law. You have to tell the kids the truth."
Hmm.
People for PSEO exists in part because some districts still resist. Um, it's like something like the resistance that was encountered in the South, shall we say, in the 60s, and frankly, in the North. So, I mean, this is another historical pattern, but the law was changed a couple of years ago to allow high school kids to use their high school computers to take courses online if they couldn't easily get to a college or university, which is the case for some kids inner city and some kids in greater Minnesota. But the law has survived, and it survived because we put together a broad coalition. So in any case, thank you very much for taking your time. Thank you for terrific advice, and glad to respond to people's questions if they want to look at Center for School Change and have additional information they'd like. And again, thank you for the terrific advice, Chris.
No, actually, I thank you, Joe, for your years and years and years and years of really being at this in a ways that I haven't seen anybody else be at it. You know, like rolling with the punches in terms of like creating a new, like this didn't work. Let's try something new. Oh my God, what an American idea. If something didn't work, how about we create another avenue? Let's never stop creating avenues for young people to like find themselves, to find their opportunity in the American landscape. I know very few people like you who have been part of multiple different ideas, didn't just stick with one. And this is why I think it's important for on this show for me to engage with thinkers who know something about something and have been around, because other folks need to know that whatever you call reform or whatever you call activism in education or whatever, it's not a one-trick pony. We can't allow people to look like the flat Stanleys, like just one thing being a flat person. You have many things to share, and I appreciate it.
So I've said a couple of times that there's one last thing, but it really is, I'm going to try to be respectful of your time. There's one last brief thing, which I actually posted over the weekend. And that is, I want to commend to people Langston Hughes' poem, Mother to Son, which I did post on several social media outlets, Twitter and Facebook and others this weekend. And I posted it for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was that when I was 15 years old, which was many years ago, because I'm now 71, I was in a march in Wichita, Kansas. This was clearly in the 50s. And it was a march for civil rights. And people were throwing rocks and bricks at us. And an elderly African-American woman with whom I was marching nearby, looked at me. She said, "You look really scared, young man." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am really scared. I'm going to stay here, but I'm really scared," because they were throwing rocks and bricks. And as a 15-year-old white boy, I was not used to having people throwing rocks and sticks and rocks. And then from memory, she recited Mother to Son. And I've never, ever forgotten the courage of this woman who told me she was in her 70s, who was marching along. So with your permission, I'm going to read this brief poem.
Yeah, right? Do it, man. Do it. Let's do it.
All right. This is Langston Hughes, Mother to Son, and it's available online. There's some African-American women who read it. Langston Hughes reads it. So I'm not going to do justice, but I do want to recommend it, and it's short. It's Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I've been climbing landings and reaching corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it's getting kind of hard. Don't you fall down. For I'm still going, honey. I'm still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair.
Ooh. Well, you know what the kids do today. Thank you, Joe. Nathan, I appreciate this, man. And that was beautiful. That was awesome. Perfect way to end a show where we're trying to show more depth and breadth to who we are as people who want different schools, want new schools, want better schools, and not just schools, just want better education for kids, whether it's in a school or not. So I appreciate you, man. And we're going to have you back again. And any ideas that you have for future shows, let me know. And to the listeners and the viewers and the watchers, I always do these book giveaway things. So anybody who gets the first 5 people who get to me, my email is christopher@activist.com. The first 5 people that get to me are going to get a copy of one of Joe's 3 books that he has published. The one that I'm currently going back to right now is Free to Teach from way back in the day. But email me. We'll get you a copy of Joe's book. And anybody who wants to find out more information about how to get in touch with Joe, there has been a tracker going across the bottom, but I can put you into touch with Joe too if you have more questions. Joe, thank you so much. Appreciate you, man.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Back at you both ways.